The sledgehammer crashed through the rotted floorboards of the chicken coop with a sound like thunder, and Eleanor Vasquez found herself staring into a darkness that would change everything she thought she knew about her late husband's past. What started as a desperate attempt to salvage anything valuable from her foreclosed farm would lead to the discovery of documents that proved D.B. Cooper's legendary 1971 hijacking was just the beginning of a decades-long operation that reached into the highest levels of government. Eleanor wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her work glove, leaving a streak of dirt across her weathered face. At 52, she had the lean, muscular build of someone who had spent years doing physical work, but her movements carried the careful precision of her military training. 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers had taught her to approach every problem methodically, even when that problem was losing everything she had worked for since returning from Afghanistan. The foreclosure notice crumpled in her back pocket, felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, 30 days to vacate the 40-acre farm that had been in Miguel's family for 3 generations. 30 days to figure out how to pay off debts that had been mounting since her husband's sudden death from a heart attack 18 months ago. The life insurance payout had barely covered his medical bills, and the farm's income had never been enough to support the mortgage payments that Miguel had somehow managed to keep current for 15 years. Before we dive deeper into Eleanor's story, drop a comment and let us know what's the most mysterious thing you've ever discovered in an old building. And if you're enjoying this incredible journey, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we're sharing another mind-blowing discovery that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about unsolved mysteries. Eleanor had spent the morning going through Miguel's workshop, hoping to find tools valuable enough to help cover the moving expenses. Her husband had been a meticulous man, organizing his equipment with the same attention to detail he had brought to his work as a civilian contractor for various government agencies. Most of his jobs had involved transportation logistics, coordinating cargo movements for military and intelligence operations that he never discussed in detail, even with his wife. Classified stuff, he would say with a gentle smile whenever Eleanor asked about his work. Nothing exciting, just moving boxes from point A to point B, but the pay is good and it keeps us comfortable. She had accepted this explanation, trusting in the steady income that allowed them to maintain the farm and plan for retirement. Miguel had always handled the finances, insisting that Eleanor shouldn't worry about such mundane details after everything she had endured during her deployments. The workshop yielded little of immediate value. Miguel's computer equipment was outdated. His technical manuals were obsolete, and most of his specialized tools were too niche to interest local buyers. Eleanor was beginning to accept that she would have to leave the farm with nothing more than her personal belongings and whatever small amount she could get for the livestock. That's when she noticed the chicken coop. The small structure sat at the far end of the property, partially hidden by overgrown blackberry bushes that Eleanor had been meaning to clear for years. Miguel had always discouraged her from paying much attention to that corner of the farm, claiming the old building was structurally unsound and potentially dangerous. "Just leave it alone, mi amor," he would say whenever she suggested renovating. "It for actual chickens. We have enough projects without taking on something that might collapse on us." But now, facing the loss of everything, Eleanor found herself reconsidering every asset on the property. Even if the building itself was worthless, the land underneath it was still part of her 40 acres. Maybe there was something salvageable in the structure, some material she could sell to help fund her transition to whatever came next. The exterior of the chicken coop was more deteriorated than Eleanor had realized. The wooden siding had weathered to a silver-grey color, and several boards had warped enough to create gaps that let in wind and rain. The roof showed obvious signs of water damage, with missing shingles and sagging sections that spoke of years of neglect. Miguel had been right about the structural integrity. The building looked like it might collapse at any moment. Eleanor circled the structure, looking for the safest way to enter and assess what might be inside. The main door was warped shut, swollen from moisture and age to the point where it wouldn't budge, despite her best efforts. The windows were too small and positioned too high to provide easy access. She was about to give up when she noticed something odd about the foundation. The chicken coop sat on a concrete slab that seemed disproportionately thick and well constructed for such a modest building. Most rural outbuildings from that era were built on simple wooden foundations or basic concrete footings. This structure sat on what appeared to be a reinforced concrete pad, at least 6 inches thick, with expansion joints and drainage channels that suggested professional construction. Eleanor's engineering background kicked in as she studied the foundation more carefully. The concrete work was high quality, possibly military or government specification, which seemed excessive for a simple farm outbuilding. The drainage channels were precisely angled to direct water away from the structure, and the expansion joints were sealed with a type of compound she recognized from her work on military installations. Her curiosity fully aroused, Eleanor retrieved a sledgehammer from Miguel's workshop and returned to the chicken coop. If the building was going to be demolished anyway when the new owners took possession, she might as well satisfy her professional interest in its construction. Besides, understanding how the foundation was built might give her insights into other improvements Miguel had made to the property over the years. Eleanor started with the floorboards near the entrance, choosing a section that looked particularly rotted and unstable. The wood was indeed compromised, breaking apart under the first few blows of the sledgehammer. But as she cleared away the debris, she realized that what she had taken for a dirt floor was actually another layer of construction. Beneath the rotted floorboards was a second floor made of marine-grade plywood, sealed and waterproofed with materials that Eleanor recognized from her military construction experience. This inner floor was in excellent condition, showing no signs of water damage or decay despite the deteriorated condition of the structure above it. Someone had gone to considerable expense to create a weatherproof barrier beneath what appeared to be a simple farm outbuilding. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she considered the implications. This level of construction suggested that the chicken coop was designed to protect something valuable from the elements, something important enough to justify the expense of military-grade materials and professional installation. Miguel had always been secretive about his government work, but she had assumed his projects involved routine logistics and transportation. This hidden construction suggested involvement in something more significant. The marine-grade plywood was secured with screws rather than nails, another indication of professional construction designed for easy access. Eleanor found Miguel's cordless drill in the workshop and returned to carefully remove a section of the inner floor. The screws came out easily, revealing that they had been removed and replaced multiple times over the years. Beneath the plywood was a gap of about 18 inches, and then another floor made of poured concrete. But this wasn't just a foundation. It was the roof of an underground chamber that extended beneath the entire footprint of the chicken coop. Eleanor could see the edges of what appeared to be a rectangular concrete box, approximately 12 feet by 8 feet, with walls that disappeared into darkness below. Eleanor's heart was racing now. Miguel had built, or helped build, a hidden underground chamber beneath their chicken coop, disguising it as a simple farm outbuilding. The construction was professional quality, designed to be waterproof and secure, suggesting it was intended to store something valuable or sensitive. Given Miguel's work with government agencies, Eleanor couldn't help but wonder if this chamber contained classified materials that her husband had been tasked to safeguard. She used a flashlight to examine the concrete ceiling of the chamber, looking for an access point. Near the center of the space, she found a section that appeared to be a removable panel, secured with the same type of screws that had held the plywood floor in place. Miguel had designed the chamber to be accessible, but only to someone who knew what to look for. Eleanor spent the next hour carefully removing the concrete panel, which turned out to be a precisely fitted cover that had been sealed with weather, stripping to prevent moisture infiltration. The engineering was impressive. Whoever had designed this system had thought through every detail necessary to create a secure, climate-controlled storage space. With the access panel removed, Eleanor found herself looking down into a chamber that was far more sophisticated than she had expected. The walls were lined with what appeared to be stainless steel, and the floor was covered with industrial carpet that showed no signs of moisture or decay. Battery-powered LED lighting strips had been installed along the walls, connected to a charging system that was still functional after years of operation. Eleanor lowered herself into the chamber, marveling at the professional quality of the construction. This wasn't just a hidden storage space. It was a secure facility designed to protect sensitive materials from environmental damage, theft, and discovery. The chamber contained multiple filing cabinets, several sealed storage containers, and a workstation with communication equipment that looked more sophisticated than anything she had seen in Miguel's workshop. The filing cabinets were locked, but Eleanor found the keys in a magnetic key holder attached to the underside of the workstation. Miguel had left everything accessible to someone who knew where to look, suggesting that he had intended for her to find this chamber eventually. Perhaps he had planned to reveal its existence before his sudden death, or maybe he had left clues that Eleanor hadn't recognized. The first filing cabinet contained what appeared to be personnel records and financial documents related to Miguel's government contracting work. But these weren't the routine logistics contracts that Eleanor had expected. The files detailed a series of covert operations involving the movement of personnel and materials for what appeared to be intelligence agencies, with payment amounts that were far larger than anything Miguel had disclosed to his wife. Eleanor's hands trembled as she reviewed document after document that painted a picture of her husband's involvement in operations that went far beyond simple transportation. Logistics. Miguel had been part of a network that moved people and resources for missions that were classified at levels Eleanor hadn't even known existed during her own military service. The scale of the operations and the amounts of money involved suggested that Miguel had been a key player in something much more significant than he had ever revealed. But it was the contents of the second filing cabinet that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. The files were labeled with dates from the early 1970s, and the first document she pulled out was a detailed analysis of the D.B. Cooper hijacking, including information that had never been made public. But this wasn't just an investigation report. It was a planning document, complete with escape routes, communication protocols, and contingency plans that suggested the hijacking had been far more sophisticated than anyone had ever realized. Eleanor sank into the chair at the workstation, struggling to process what she was discovering. Her husband, the quiet man who had claimed to move boxes from point A to point B, had been involved in operations that included detailed knowledge of one of America's most famous unsolved crimes. The document suggested that D.B. Cooper's escape hadn't been the work of a lone criminal, but part of a larger operation that had continued for decades after the 1971 hijacking. As Eleanor continued reading, she began to understand that what she had discovered wasn't just historical documents about a famous crime. The files contained current intelligence assessments, ongoing surveillance reports, and operational plans that suggested the D.B. Cooper network was still active, still, moving people and resources for purposes that remained classified. Miguel hadn't just been storing old documents. He had been maintaining an active operational archive for something that was very much still happening. The implications were staggering. Eleanor had stumbled onto evidence of a covert operation that had been running for over 50 years, using the D.B. Cooper legend as cover for activities that apparently reached into the highest levels of government. Her husband had been a key player in this network, and his sudden death had left her as the unwitting inheritor of secrets that powerful people would kill to protect. Eleanor's military training kicked in as she realized the danger she was now facing. The foreclosure of the farm wasn't just a financial disaster, it was a deadline. Someone wanted her off this property before she could discover what Miguel had been hiding. The timing of the foreclosure, coming so soon after Miguel's death, suggested that his former associates were already moving to secure the materials he had been safeguarding. She needed to understand exactly what she had inherited before anyone else discovered that she had found Miguel's hidden chamber. Eleanor began photographing documents with her phone, focusing on the most sensitive materials while trying to understand the scope of the operation her husband had been part of. With each page she documented, the picture became clearer and more frightening. D.B. Cooper hadn't been a criminal. He had been an operative. His hijacking had been a cover for extraction operation that had allowed him to disappear into a network that continued to operate decades later. Miguel had been part of that network, helping to move people and resources for missions that remained classified at the highest levels of government. And now, Eleanor was the only person who knew the truth about an operation that had been hidden in plain sight for over half a century. The sound of vehicles approaching the farm made Eleanor's blood run cold. Through the small gaps in the walls, she could see black SUVs pulling into her driveway, the kind of government vehicles that she recognized from her own military service. Miguel's former associates had discovered that she had found the chamber, and they were coming to secure the materials he had been protecting. Eleanor quickly gathered the most important documents, stuffing them into a waterproof bag she found. Among Miguel's supplies, she had minutes, maybe less, before the people in those vehicles reached the chicken coop. Everything she thought she knew about her husband, her marriage, and her life was about to change forever. The bankruptcy and foreclosure that had seemed like the end of her world were actually just the beginning of a journey that would force her to question everything she believed about truth, loyalty, and the price of keeping secrets that could reshape American history. Eleanor's fingers fumbled with the waterproof bag as footsteps crunched across the gravel driveway above her head. The voices were getting closer, professional and clipped in the way that told her these weren't bank representatives or local law enforcement. These were federal agents, and they knew exactly what they were looking for. "The widow's truck is here, but the house appears empty," a woman's voice called out, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Spread out and check the outbuildings. She may have already found what we're looking for." Eleanor pressed herself against the steel-lined wall of the hidden chamber, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would give away her position. Through the gaps in the deteriorated chicken coop above, she could see shadows moving across the yard as multiple agents took positions around the property. They moved with military precision, covering sight lines and establishing a perimeter that would prevent anyone from leaving undetected. The beam of a powerful flashlight suddenly cut through the gaps in the chicken coop walls, sweeping methodically across the interior space. Eleanor held her breath as the light passed over the section of floor she had torn up, knowing that any trained investigator would immediately recognize the signs of recent disturbance. She had been careless in her excitement to explore Miguel's hidden chamber, leaving obvious evidence that someone had discovered the secret beneath their feet. "Agent Morrison, you need to see this." A male voice called from directly above Eleanor's hiding spot. Heavy boots walked across the wooden floor of the chicken coop, and Eleanor could hear the agent examining the hole she had created with her sledgehammer. "Someone's been here recently. Looks like they found the access point." Agent Morrison's heels clicked as she approached, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of polished black shoes through the gaps in the floorboards. "How long?" Morrison asked, her voice carrying the cold professionalism that Eleanor remembered from her own interactions with intelligence personnel during her military deployments. "Hard to say exactly, but the wood chips are still fresh, and there's no dust settled on the debris. I'd estimate within the last few hours, maybe less." The male agent's voice was closer now, and Eleanor could see him kneeling near the opening she had created. Whoever did this knew what they were looking for. They went straight for the access panel without damaging the surrounding structure. Eleanor's mind raced as she tried to understand the implications of what she was overhearing. These agents hadn't come to the farm by accident. They had been monitoring the property, waiting for something to happen. Miguel's death had triggered some kind of protocol, and the foreclosure proceedings were apparently part of a plan to secure whatever he had been protecting. But something had gone wrong with their timeline, and Eleanor's discovery of the chamber had forced them to move before they were ready. But the most shocking revelation came in a file dated just 6 months before Miguel's death. Coleman, the original D.B. Cooper, was still alive, still active within the network, and had been operating under the identity Miguel had helped maintain for over 50 years. Eleanor's husband hadn't just been storing historical documents about a famous crime. He had been providing logistical support for one of the most wanted fugitives in American history. The implications were staggering. If Cooper was still alive and active, then the network he represented was far more extensive and current than Eleanor had initially realized. The files suggested that dozens of operatives were maintained within the network, carrying out missions that ranged from industrial espionage to political assassination, all under the cover of identities that had been declared officially dead decades ago. Eleanor found herself looking at surveillance photographs that had been taken within the past year, showing an elderly man who bore a strong resemblance to the age-progressed sketches of D.B. Cooper that the FBI had released. The man was identified in the files as Subject 1, and his activities included meetings with high-level government officials, defense contractors, and foreign intelligence operatives. Cooper hadn't disappeared into obscurity after his famous hijacking. He had used his presumed death as cover for 5 decades of covert operations. The morning sun was beginning to rise over the mountains as Eleanor finished reading the most sensitive files from Miguel's collection. Her husband had been part of a shadow network that operated parallel to official government agencies, carrying out missions that were too sensitive or too illegal for conventional intelligence operations. The network used the identities of people who had been declared dead, starting with Cooper but expanding over the years to include dozens of other operatives who had been extracted from compromised assignments. Eleanor understood now why the agents had been so desperate to secure Miguel's materials. The files she had discovered didn't just reveal historical information about a famous unsolved crime. They contained current operational details about a network that was still active, still carrying out missions that could reshape American foreign policy if they were exposed. Miguel's death had created a security breach that threatened to expose 50 years of covert operations. But Eleanor also realized that she was now in possession of information that made her incredibly valuable to the right people. The files contained detailed information about foreign intelligence operations, domestic surveillance programs, and covert actions that various government factions would pay enormous sums to either obtain or suppress. She wasn't just a widow who had stumbled onto her husband's secrets. She was now a player in intelligence operations that reached the highest levels of government. The sound of helicopters in the distance made Eleanor look up from the documents spread across the truck's dashboard. Through the mountains, she could see aircraft moving in a search pattern that was gradually expanding outward from the direction of her farm. The agents who had raided her property were now conducting a full-scale manhunt, using resources that suggested her case had been elevated to the highest priority levels. Eleanor carefully returned the documents to their waterproof bag and started Harold's truck. She needed to find a secure location where she could study the remaining files without interference, but she also needed to begin planning her next move. The information she had discovered made it impossible to simply return to her old life. Too many powerful people now had reasons to silence her permanently. As she drove deeper into the mountains, Eleanor began to understand that her discovery of Miguel's hidden chamber had transformed her from a bankrupt widow into something much more dangerous and valuable. She possessed information that could destroy careers, expose illegal operations, and reveal secrets that had been protected for half a century. The question now was whether she could survive long enough to decide what to do with that knowledge. Eleanor drove Harold's truck deeper into the Cascade Mountains, following logging roads that wound through dense forests of Douglas fir and western hemlock. The rough terrain would make it difficult for the helicopters to maintain visual contact, and the thick canopy provided natural cover from aerial surveillance. Her military experience had taught her that the best defense against superior forces was to use terrain to your advantage, forcing the enemy to fight on ground of your choosing. The fuel gauge was approaching empty when Eleanor spotted a weathered sign marking the entrance to Whispering Pines Campground, a small recreational area that appeared to have been abandoned for several seasons. The access road was partially blocked by fallen trees, but Harold's truck had enough clearance to navigate around the obstacles. This isolated location would provide the privacy Eleanor needed to study Miguel's files without interruption. The campground consisted of a dozen primitive sites, scattered among towering evergreens, with a small creek running through the center of the area. Most of the picnic tables had been damaged by falling branches, and the fire rings were filled with leaves and debris. Eleanor chose a site that was well concealed from the main road, but still provided multiple escape routes if she needed to. Leave quickly. She spread Miguel's documents across the least damaged picnic table, weighing them down with rocks to prevent the mountain breeze from scattering pages that could reshape her understanding of American intelligence operations. The morning sun, filtering through the forest canopy, provided enough light to read, but Eleanor knew she would need to work quickly. The agents searching for her would eventually expand their search to include abandoned recreational areas. The third file she examined contained operational plans that made Eleanor's blood run cold. The network that Miguel had served wasn't just supporting deep cover operatives. It was actively manipulating domestic politics through a series of false flag operations designed to justify increased surveillance and military spending. The documents outlined plans to stage terrorist attacks, assassinate political figures, and create international incidents that would shift public opinion towards supporting more aggressive foreign policies. Eleanor had to read several pages twice before she could fully comprehend the scope of what she was discovering. The network had been responsible for events that had shaped decades of American history, from the Kennedy assassination to the September 11th attacks. Each operation had been carefully planned to achieve specific political objectives, while maintaining complete deniability for the official government agencies that secretly authorized them. The most disturbing revelation was that the network operated with the knowledge and approval of a select group of officials who represented both major political parties. The documents included meeting notes from sessions where senators, cabinet members, and intelligence directors had discussed specific operations and their expected outcomes. The American political system wasn't just influenced by covert operations. It was actively controlled by them. Eleanor found herself struggling to accept what she was reading. Her 20 years of military service had been based on the belief that she was defending constitutional democracy against foreign threats. The documents in front of her suggested that the greatest threat to American democracy came from within the government itself, from officials who had decided that the Constitution was an obstacle to effective governance rather than its foundation. Photograph in the fourth file made Eleanor's hands shake with recognition. The image showed Miguel standing beside a man she now knew was Daniel Coleman, the original D.B. Cooper, at what appeared to be a training facility in the mountains of Colorado. Both men were wearing military-style clothing and carrying equipment. That suggested they were preparing for a covert operation. The date stamp on the photograph indicated it had been taken just 3 years ago, proving that Miguel's involvement in the network had continued until shortly before his death. Eleanor had thought she knew her husband completely. They had shared 25 years of marriage, had discussed everything from politics to philosophy during long evening walks around their farm. Miguel had been gentle, thoughtful, and seemingly incapable of the kind of deception that would be required to participate in operations involving assassination and terrorism. The man in the photograph looked like her husband, but he was someone Eleanor had never met. The sound of a vehicle approaching on the access road made Eleanor quickly gather the documents and move to a position where she could observe the campground entrance without being seen. A Forest Service truck emerged from the trees, driven by a ranger who appeared to be conducting a routine patrol of the area. Eleanor remained hidden until the truck disappeared around a bend in the road, then returned to her examination of Miguel's files. The fifth file contained financial records that revealed another layer of the network's operations. The covert activities were funded through a complex web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and cryptocurrency transactions that generated billions of dollars annually. The network wasn't just carrying out operations for ideological reasons. It was also operating as a highly profitable criminal enterprise that used political manipulation to create market opportunities for its financial backers. Eleanor began to understand why the agents had been so desperate to secure Miguel's materials. The files she had discovered didn't just reveal historical information about covert operations. They contained current financial data that could be used to trace the network's funding sources and identify its modern participants. The account numbers, cryptocurrency addresses, and shell company registrations in the files represented a roadmap to dismantling a criminal enterprise that had been operating for over 50 years. But Eleanor also realized that the financial information made her an even more valuable target. The people who had invested in the network's operations had billions of dollars at stake, and they would stop at nothing to prevent their exposure. She wasn't just being pursued by government agents, she was being hunted by some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in America. The sixth file contained operational plans that were scheduled to be implemented within the next 6 months. The network was planning a series of domestic terrorist attacks that would be blamed on foreign operatives, providing justification for a massive expansion of surveillance powers and military spending. The attacks would target civilian populations in major cities, with casualty estimates that ran into the thousands. Eleanor found herself reading detailed plans for bombing government buildings, poisoning water supplies, and assassinating elected officials who had opposed the network's agenda. The operations were designed to create a climate of fear that would allow the network's political allies to suspend constitutional protections and implement martial law in affected areas. The American people would surrender their remaining freedoms in exchange for the promise of security against threats that were actually being created by their own government. The scope of the planned operations made Eleanor realize that she possessed information that could prevent mass casualties and preserve constitutional democracy. But using that information would require her to survive long enough to find trustworthy people within the government who weren't already compromised by the network. The files suggested that the network had infiltrated every major intelligence agency and law enforcement organization, making it nearly impossible to know who could be trusted. Eleanor's train of thought was interrupted by the sound of helicopters. Approaching from multiple directions, through the forest canopy, she could see aircraft moving in a coordinated search pattern that was systematically covering every square mile of the surrounding area. The search teams had expanded their operation to include the entire mountain region, using resources that suggested her case had been elevated to the highest national security priority. She quickly packed Miguel's documents and prepared to abandon the campground. The helicopters were still several miles away, but their search pattern indicated they would reach her location within the next hour. Eleanor needed to find a more secure hiding place, preferably one that would allow her to continue studying the files while avoiding detection by the increasing number of people looking for her. Harold's truck started reluctantly, the engine coughing and sputtering in the cold mountain air. Eleanor realized that the vehicle was showing signs of age and stress that could leave her stranded in a remote location with no means of escape. She needed to find alternative transportation, but that would require contact with other people who might report her location to the authorities. The logging road wound deeper into the mountains, passing through areas that had been clear-cut decades ago and were now showing signs of natural regeneration. Young trees grew in dense clusters between the stumps of their predecessors, creating a landscape that spoke of destruction and renewal. Eleanor couldn't help but see parallels between the forest's recovery and her own situation. Sometimes, destruction was necessary before something better could grow in its place. After 20 minutes of driving, Eleanor spotted a sign for Mountain View Lodge, a small resort that catered to hunters and fishermen during the peak seasons. The facility appeared to be closed for the winter, with snow covering the access road and no signs of recent activity. Eleanor decided to investigate the lodge as a potential hiding place, hoping to find shelter that would allow her to continue her analysis of Miguel's files. The lodge was larger than it had appeared from the road, consisting of a main building and several smaller cabins scattered among the trees. All of the structures appeared to be locked and secured for the winter season, but Eleanor's military training had included instruction in gaining access to secured facilities. She found a basement window that had been left partially open for ventilation, providing access to the lodge's lower level. The basement contained storage areas and mechanical equipment, but it also included a small workshop that appeared to be used for maintaining the lodge's facilities. The workshop had electric power, adequate lighting, and a workbench that would serve as a suitable surface for examining documents. Eleanor settled into the space and resumed her study of Miguel's files, knowing that she might have several hours before the search teams reached this remote location. The 7th file contained surveillance reports that made Eleanor realize the network had been monitoring her activities since shortly after Miguel's death. The reports included detailed information about her financial struggles, her efforts to save the farm, and her daily routines. The network had known about her discovery of the hidden chamber before she had even fully understood what she had found. The surveillance reports revealed that Eleanor's movements had been tracked through her cell phone, her credit card transactions, and her vehicle's registration. The network had access to databases that allowed them to monitor anyone they considered a potential security threat, using information that was supposed to be protected by privacy laws and constitutional restrictions. Eleanor realized that every move since leaving the farm had been known to the people pursuing her, But the surveillance reports also revealed something encouraging. The network was concerned about Eleanor's military background and her potential ability to evade capture. The reports noted her engineering training, her combat experience, and her security clearance, all of which suggested she possessed skills that could make her a formidable adversary. The network's caution indicated that Eleanor might have more advantages than she had initially realized. The eighth file contained communication intercepts that revealed the network's current operational status. Eleanor learned that Miguel's death had created a significant security breach that had forced the network to postpone several planned operations while they assessed the extent of the compromise. Her discovery of the hidden chamber had elevated the security threat to the highest level, requiring the network to divert resources from other activities to focus on containing the breach. The communication intercepts also revealed that the network was divided about how to handle Eleanor's case. Some operatives wanted to eliminate her immediately to prevent further security breaches, while others argued that her death would create additional complications that could expose the network to greater scrutiny. The debate had apparently reached the highest levels of the network's leadership, with no clear consensus on the best course of action. Eleanor realized that the network's uncertainty created an opportunity for her to take action before they could reach a decision about her fate. The file she had discovered contained enough information to expose the network's operations and prevent the planned terrorist attacks, but she needed to find a way to disseminate that information without being captured or killed. The challenge was identifying trustworthy people within the government who weren't already compromised by the network's influence. As afternoon approached, Eleanor heard the sound of vehicles approaching the lodge from the main road. Through the basement window, she could see several SUVs and trucks approaching the facility, their occupants wearing the tactical gear and communication equipment that identified them as members of the search teams. Eleanor gathered Miguel's documents and prepared to evacuate the lodge through the basement exit she had identified earlier. But as she reached the exit, Eleanor heard something that made her freeze in place. One of the searchers was calling out her name, not with the harsh authority she had expected from government agents, but with the concerned tone of someone who wanted to help rather than capture her. The voice was familiar, though Eleanor couldn't immediately place it. "Eleanor Vasquez, my name is Sarah Morrison. I was a friend of your husband's, and I know you're scared and confused right now. I'm here to help you understand what Miguel was really involved in, and why the information you've discovered is so important. I know you have questions, and I have answers, but we need to talk before the people who want to hurt you find this location." Eleanor remained hidden in the basement, uncertain whether to trust the woman calling her name. The voice sounded sincere, but Eleanor had learned that deception was a fundamental tool of the network Miguel had served. The person calling herself Sarah Morrison could be an operative using psychological manipulation to convince Eleanor to surrender voluntarily. But Eleanor also realized that her current situation was unsustainable. She couldn't remain hidden indefinitely, and the information she had discovered was too important to die with her if she was captured or killed. Some point, she would need to trust someone if she wanted to expose the network and prevent the planned terrorist attacks. The question was whether Sarah Morrison was that person, or just another agent of the network that had already destroyed so many lives. The sound of footsteps approaching the lodge made Eleanor's decision for her. She had seconds to choose between surrendering to someone who claimed to be an ally, or attempting to escape through terrain that was surrounded by search teams. Everything she had learned about Miguel's secret life had prepared her for this moment of choice, when she would have to decide whether to trust a stranger who might be her salvation or her destruction. Eleanor made her decision in the space between heartbeats, She climbed the basement stairs slowly, Miguel's documents clutched against her chest, and opened the lodge's front door to face whatever waited outside. Sarah Morrison stood 20 feet away, hands visible and empty, wearing civilian clothes that looked more like hiking gear than tactical equipment. She was a woman in her early 50s, with graying brown hair and intelligent eyes that held none of the cold calculation Eleanor had seen in the federal agents who had raided her farm. "Thank you for trusting me," Sarah said quietly, making no move to approach. "I know how difficult this must be. Miguel talked about you often during our briefings. He was proud of your military service and worried about what would happen to you if something happened to him." Eleanor kept her distance, studying Sarah's face for signs of deception. "You say you were Miguel's friend, but I never heard him mention anyone named Sarah Morrison. My husband didn't have friends I didn't know about." Sarah nodded, understanding Eleanor's suspicion. "He knew me by a different name during our operational assignments. Sarah Morrison is my current identity, the one I've been using since I left the network 3 years ago. Miguel helped me disappear when I decided I couldn't continue participating in operations that violated everything I believed about protecting American citizens." The explanation resonated with Eleanor's growing understanding of how the network operated. If operatives used multiple identities over the course of their careers, it would make sense that Miguel might have known colleagues under names that bore no resemblance to their current identities. But Eleanor needed more proof before she would entrust anyone connected to her husband's secret life. "What was Miguel's operational designation?" Eleanor asked, testing Sarah's knowledge of details that wouldn't be available to someone who hadn't actually worked with her husband. "Shepherd 7, Sarah replied without hesitation. "He coordinated logistics for extraction operations, primarily in South America and Eastern Europe. His specialty was creating transportation networks that could move people and equipment without leaving official records. Miguel was one of the best logistics coordinators the network ever had." Eleanor felt a chill of recognition. She had found references to Shepherd 7 throughout Miguel's files, but she hadn't realized it was her husband's operational code name. Sarah's knowledge of this detail suggested she was telling the truth about her connection to Miguel, but it also meant she possessed information about operations that Eleanor was only beginning to understand. "The other vehicles," Eleanor said, nodding toward the SUVs and trucks that had accompanied Sarah to the lodge. "Who are they?" Sarah turned to gesture toward the other vehicles, and Eleanor could see their occupants clearly for the first time. Instead of the tactical gear and military bearing she had expected, she saw people wearing ordinary civilian clothes, men and women of various ages who looked more like concerned citizens than government operatives. "Former network members," Sarah explained. "People who worked with Miguel over the years and shared his growing concerns about the direction the network was taking. When word spread that you had discovered Miguel's cache and were being hunted by active operatives, we organized to find you before they could silence you." Eleanor counted 8 people spread among the vehicles, all of them maintaining defensive positions that suggested military or law enforcement training. But their posture was protective rather than aggressive, creating a perimeter that would shield her from outside threats rather than prevent her from escaping. "Why should I trust any of you?" Eleanor asked. "For all I know, this is just another network operation designed to convince me to surrender the documents voluntarily." A man emerged from one of the SUVs, moving slowly with his hands visible. He was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent years in challenging environments. When he spoke, his voice carried the faint trace of an accent that Eleanor couldn't immediately identify. "Because we have something the active network doesn't," he said, approaching to within conversation distance. "We have a conscience. My name is David Chen, and I helped train your husband when he first joined the network 30 years ago. Miguel was recruited because of his engineering skills and his ability to solve complex logistical problems, but he stayed because he believed he was serving his country. David paused, his expression growing somber. It took years for Miguel to realize that the operations he was supporting had nothing to do with protecting America and everything to do with protecting the wealth and power of a small group of individuals who had decided they were above the law. When he finally understood what he was really part of, he began documenting everything as insurance against the day when he might need to expose the network's activities. Eleanor studied David's face, looking for signs of the deception she had learned to recognize during her military intelligence training. Instead, she saw the weight of years spent carrying secrets that had gradually become unbearable. David's explanation matched what Eleanor had discovered in Miguel's files, providing independent confirmation of her husband's transformation from willing participant to reluctant observer. "Miguel mentioned you," Sarah added, supporting David's account. "He said you were the one who taught him that following orders wasn't enough, that every operative had a responsibility to consider the moral implications of their actions. Miguel credited you with helping him understand that loyalty to country meant more than loyalty to the network." Eleanor felt something shifting in her understanding of Miguel's final years. She had noticed changes in her husband's behavior, periods of distraction and apparent depression that he had attributed to work stress. Now she realized that Miguel had been struggling with the knowledge of what he was really part of, carrying the burden of secrets that were eating away at his conscience. "The heart attack," Eleanor said, making a connection she hadn't considered before. "Was it really natural?" "Yours is?" David and Sarah exchanged a look that confirmed Eleanor's suspicions. Miguel had been asking questions about operations that made his handlers nervous, David explained. He was also beginning to make contact with former operatives who had left the network under suspicious circumstances. The timing of his death was convenient for people who were concerned about his loyalty. Eleanor felt a surge of anger that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. Her husband hadn't just died unexpectedly. He had been murdered by the same network he had served faithfully for decades. The people who had claimed to be protecting American interests had killed an American veteran because he had developed moral concerns about their activities. "How many others?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight with controlled fury. "How many former operatives have died under suspicious circumstances?" 17 in the past 5 years, Sarah replied. All of them had expressed concerns about the network's direction or had attempted to leave the organization. The official causes of death included heart attacks, car accidents, suicides, and random crimes. But the pattern was clear to those of us who were paying attention. Eleanor realized that Miguel's cache of documents represented more than just evidence of the network's operations. It was his attempt to ensure that his death wouldn't be meaningless. By preserving detailed records of the network's activities, Miguel had created a weapon that could be used to expose the people who had killed him and prevent them from silencing others who posed similar threats. "What's your plan?" Eleanor asked, making a decision to trust these people who had risked their own safety to protect her. "What do we do with the information Miguel collected?" David smiled for the first time since Eleanor had met him. "We complete the work Miguel started. We expose the network's operations and prevent the terrorist attacks they're planning. But first, we need to get you somewhere safe where we can study the documents you recovered and plan our next moves." Eleanor looked around at the group of former operatives who had organized to protect her, people who had sacrificed their own security to prevent innocent Americans from being killed by their former colleagues. These were individuals who had served their country in the shadows for decades, only to discover that they had been manipulated into betraying the very principles they thought they were defending. "Where can we go that the network won't find us?" Eleanor asked. "They have access to surveillance systems that can track anyone they consider a threat." Sarah nodded toward the mountains that surrounded the lodge. "There are places in the wilderness that are invisible to electronic surveillance, locations that were established decades ago as safe houses for operatives who needed to disappear. Miguel helped design some of these facilities, and he made sure that information about their locations was included in his cache." Eleanor understood that Sarah was referring to the detailed maps and coordinates she had seen in Miguel's files, information that had seemed like random intelligence data, but apparently represented a network of secure facilities that could support covert operations. Miguel had not only documented the network's crimes, he had also preserved the infrastructure that could be used to oppose them. "There's something else you need to know," David said, his expression growing serious. "The network is planning to accelerate their timeline because of the security breach created by your discovery of Miguel's cache. The terrorist attacks that were scheduled for implementation over the next 6 months are now being moved up to the next 6 weeks. Eleanor felt her blood run cold as she realized the implications. The network was willing to risk exposure of their long-term operations in order to implement the attacks that would justify the suspension of constitutional protections. Her discovery of Miguel's documents had forced them to choose between preserving their secrecy and achieving their immediate political objectives. "How do you know about the accelerated timeline?" Eleanor asked. "Because some of us still have contacts within the active network," Sarah explained. "Former colleagues who share our concerns but haven't yet found the courage to leave. They're feeding us information about current operations, hoping that we can find a way to stop what's coming." Eleanor began to understand that the situation was more complex than she had initially realized. The network wasn't a monolithic organization with universal support for its operations. It was a collection of individuals with varying levels of commitment to the organization's goals. Some members were true believers who would support any action that advanced their agenda, while others were beginning to question whether the costs of their operations were justified by the benefits. "What kind of attacks are they planning?" Eleanor asked, dreading the answer. David opened a tablet computer and showed Eleanor a map of the United States with several cities marked in red. "Coordinated bombings in New York, Washington, Los Angeles, and Chicago. The attacks are designed to look like the work of foreign terrorists, but they'll actually be carried out by network operatives using materials that will be traced back to countries the network wants to justify military action against." Eleanor studied the map, noting that the targeted cities represented major population centers that would generate maximum media coverage and public fear. The attacks were designed not just to kill innocent people, but to manipulate public opinion in support of policies that would benefit the network's political and financial backers. "The casualties," Eleanor whispered, unable to finish the question. "Conservative estimates suggest 10,000 dead, with several times that number injured," Sarah replied. "The network considers these acceptable losses in pursuit of their larger objectives." Eleanor felt sick as she contemplated the scope of the planned atrocities. The network was preparing to murder thousands of innocent Americans in order to justify policies that would make them wealthier and more powerful. The people she had trusted to protect the country were planning to destroy it from within. "We have to stop them," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the determination that had sustained her through combat deployments in Afghanistan. "Whatever it takes, we have to prevent these attacks." David nodded approvingly. That's exactly what Miguel would have said. He knew that someday the information he was collecting would be used to hold the network accountable for their crimes. The question is whether we can move fast enough to prevent the attacks, while also gathering enough evidence to expose the network's operations permanently. Eleanor looked around at the faces of the former operatives who had risked everything to protect her and prevent mass murder. These were people who understood the true cost of the network's operations, individuals who had chosen conscience over career and truth over security. They represented everything that was best about American intelligence services, even as they opposed everything that was worst about the same organizations. "What's the first step?" Eleanor asked, ready to begin the most important mission of her life. Sarah smiled, recognizing the shift in Eleanor's thinking from victim to participant. "First, we need to get you and Miguel's documents to a secure location where we can study them in detail and begin planning our operations. The safe house Miguel helped design is about 50 miles from here, hidden in terrain that will be difficult for the network's search teams to cover effectively." Eleanor nodded, understanding that she was about to enter a phase of her life that would be completely different from anything she had experienced before. The bankrupt widow who had discovered her husband's secrets was being transformed into an operative in a shadow war that would determine the future of American democracy. As she prepared to leave the lodge with her new allies, Eleanor realized that Miguel's death had not been the end of his fight against the network. It had been the beginning of her own. The documents he had preserved and the people he had trusted were now her responsibility, and she would not let his sacrifice be meaningless. The terrorists who threatened America weren't hiding in foreign countries or plotting in distant caves. They were wearing expensive suits and working in government offices, planning attacks that would kill thousands of innocent people while advancing their own political and financial interests. Eleanor had stumbled onto their plans by accident, but she would stop them by design, using every skill she had learned during 20 years of military service to protect the country she had sworn to defend. The convoy of vehicles wound through mountain roads that became progressively narrower and more primitive as they climbed toward the coordinates Miguel had preserved in his files. Eleanor rode with Sarah in the lead SUV, studying topographic maps that showed their destination as nothing more than empty wilderness. The safe house Miguel had helped design was invisible to satellite surveillance, built into terrain that appeared unremarkable from above, but provided perfect concealment for covert operations. Miguel was brilliant at finding locations like this, Sarah explained, as they navigated a particularly steep switchback. He understood that the best hiding places weren't exotic or remote. They were ordinary-looking spots that surveillance systems would ignore because they appeared to have no strategic value. Eleanor traced their route on the map, noting how Miguel had chosen a path that avoided major roads, cell tower coverage areas, and known surveillance installations. Even the approach to the safe house had been designed to minimize their electronic signature, keeping them invisible to the tracking systems that had monitored Eleanor's every move since leaving her farm. The safe house itself was a revelation in camouflage and concealment. From the outside, it appeared to be nothing more than a weathered hunting cabin that had been abandoned years ago. The roof was covered with moss and fallen branches. The walls were stained with decades of mountain weather, and the windows were boarded up as if the structure had been condemned. Only someone who knew what to look for would notice the subtle signs that indicated the building was far more sophisticated than it appeared. David led the group through a security protocol that revealed the true nature of Miguel's construction. What appeared to be rotting boards actually concealed steel reinforcement. The boarded windows were bulletproof glass with one-way visibility, and the entire structure was powered by solar panels that were invisible from ground level. The interior was a state-of-the-art operations center with communication equipment, computer systems, and living facilities that could support a dozen people for months without outside contact. Miguel spent 3 years building this place, David explained as he activated the facility's systems. He claimed it was a hunting cabin he was renovating as a retirement project, but he was actually creating a base of operations for people like us, former network members who had decided to oppose the organization's criminal activities. Eleanor marveled at the facility's sophistication while struggling to reconcile this evidence of Miguel's long-term planning with the man she had thought she knew. Her husband had been preparing for this conflict for years, building infrastructure and gathering intelligence while maintaining the facade of a loyal operative. Miguel had been living a triple life: as Eleanor's husband, as a network operative, and as a member of the resistance that was now protecting her. The other former operatives began setting up workstations and communication equipment with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before. Eleanor realized that Sarah's group wasn't just a collection of concerned individuals who had spontaneously organized to help her. They were an established resistance cell that had been operating in opposition to the network for years. "How long have you been planning this?" Eleanor asked as she watched the team transform the hunting cabin into a fully operational command center. "Ever since we realized that the network had been infiltrated by people whose primary loyalty was to money rather than country," Sarah replied. "It started with informal conversations between operatives who were concerned about the direction of our missions. Over time, we began to understand that we weren't just witnessing the corruption of an intelligence organization. We were seeing the transformation of American foreign policy into a tool for personal enrichment." Eleanor spread Miguel's documents across a conference table that had been built into the cabin's main room. Under the facility's professional lighting, she could see details in the files that had been difficult to read in the forest campground. The scope of the network's operations was even more extensive than she had initially realized, encompassing not just the planned terrorist attacks, but a comprehensive strategy for reshaping American society. "They're not just planning to suspend constitutional protections," Eleanor said as she studied the operational plans. "They're planning to eliminate them permanently. The attacks are designed to create a crisis that will justify the declaration of martial law, but the network has already prepared legislation that would make those emergency powers permanent." David joined Eleanor at the conference table, his expression growing darker as he reviewed the documents she had discovered. "The Domestic Security Enhancement Act," he said, reading from one of the files. "They've been working on this legislation for years, waiting for the right crisis to justify its implementation. The terrorist attacks will provide that crisis." Eleanor read over David's shoulder, horrified by the scope of the proposed legislation. The act would suspend habeas corpus, authorize indefinite detention without charges, permit surveillance of all electronic communications without warrants, and establish military tribunals to try civilians accused of terrorism-related offenses. The Constitution would become a historical document with no practical relevance to American governance. "This isn't about preventing terrorism," Eleanor realized. "This is about establishing a police state that would allow the network to operate without any legal constraints whatsoever." Sarah nodded grimly. "The network has always been frustrated by constitutional protections that limited their ability to act against perceived threats. They've concluded that American democracy is an obstacle to effective governance, and they're planning to remove that obstacle permanently." Eleanor felt a chill as she understood the full implications of what the network was planning. The terrorist attacks weren't just designed to kill innocent people, they were designed to kill American democracy itself. The network was planning to use the fear generated by mass casualties to convince the American people to surrender the very freedoms that defined their national identity. "What about the international response?" Eleanor asked. "Other countries won't accept the elimination of constitutional government in America." "The network has contingency plans for that too," David replied, showing Eleanor another section of Miguel's files. They're planning to blame the attacks on state sponsors of terrorism, providing justification for military action against countries that have resources the network wants to control. The international community will be too concerned about American military retaliation to focus on domestic constitutional issues. Eleanor studied the target list for the planned military operations, noting that every country on the list possessed either significant oil reserves, strategic mineral deposits, or other resources that would generate enormous profits for the network's corporate partners. The terrorist attacks would serve multiple purposes, eliminating constitutional protections domestically while justifying resource extraction operations internationally. "How do we stop this?" Eleanor asked, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of the conspiracy she had uncovered. "We expose it," Sarah replied simply. "We take the evidence Miguel collected and present it to people who still believe in constitutional government. There are still honest officials in Congress, the courts, and the military who would act to prevent these attacks if they understood what was being planned." Eleanor looked around at the faces of the former operatives who had risked everything to oppose the network's plans. "How do we know who we can trust? The network has infiltrated every major government institution." "We start with people who have already demonstrated their integrity," David explained. "There are officials who have consistently opposed the expansion of surveillance powers, judges who have ruled against unconstitutional government actions, and military officers who have refused to participate in operations they considered illegal." Miguel kept a list of such people as potential allies if the network's activities ever needed to be exposed. Eleanor found Miguel's list among the documents, noting that it included senators, federal judges, investigative journalists, and military officers from all branches of the armed services. Her husband had been carefully identifying potential allies for years, building a network of honest officials who could be trusted to act on information about the conspiracy. "The problem is coordination," Sarah continued. "We need to present this information simultaneously to multiple officials, preventing the network from silencing key individuals before they can act. If we approach people one at a time, the network will identify our activities and neutralize both us and our contacts." Eleanor understood the challenge. The network's surveillance capabilities would detect any attempt to contact government officials through normal channels, allowing them to intercept communications and eliminate threats before they could act. The resistance would need to use unconventional methods to disseminate Miguel's evidence without alerting the network to their activities. "What about the media?" Eleanor asked. "Couldn't we release this information to journalists who would investigate and report on the network's activities?" David shook his head. "The network has extensive influence over major media organizations. Most journalists who might be willing to investigate this story work for companies that receive significant advertising revenue from network-affiliated corporations. The stories would be suppressed before they could reach the public." Eleanor felt frustration building as she realized the extent of the network's influence over American institutions. They controlled not just intelligence agencies and law enforcement organizations, but also the media outlets that might expose their activities, and the financial institutions that might trace their funding sources. The network had systematically corrupted every institution that might serve as a check on their power. "There has to be a way," Eleanor insisted. "Miguel didn't preserve all this evidence just so we could admire the scope of the conspiracy. He must have had a plan for using it to stop the network." Sarah smiled for the first time since Eleanor had met her. "Actually, he did. Miguel developed a strategy for exposing the network that would bypass their institutional influence and appeal directly to American citizens. But implementing his plan would require us to take enormous risks and probably sacrifice our own safety." Eleanor leaned forward, eager to understand Miguel's strategy. What kind of plan? Simultaneous public disclosure, David explained. Instead of trying to work through compromised institutions, we would release Miguel's evidence simultaneously through multiple channels that the network couldn't control. Independent media outlets, social media platforms, academic institutions, and foreign news organizations that aren't subject to network influence. Eleanor considered the strategy, recognizing both its potential effectiveness and its dangers. The network would know immediately that we were responsible for the disclosure. They would use every resource at their disposal to discredit us and suppress the information. That's why the disclosure would need to be massive and immediate, Sarah added. We would release everything at once. The evidence of planned terrorist attacks, the financial records showing how the network is funded, the operational plans for suspending constitutional government, and the historical documentation of previous network operations. The sheer volume of information would make it impossible for the network to suppress everything before it reached the public. Eleanor realized that Miguel's plan would require the resistance to expose themselves completely, abandoning any hope of returning to normal lives in exchange for the possibility of preventing mass murder and preserving constitutional government. It was a strategy that demanded total commitment from everyone involved. What about the accelerated timeline for the attacks? Eleanor asked. Do we have enough time to organize a coordinated disclosure operation? David consulted his tablet computer, checking encrypted messages from contacts within the active network. Our sources indicate that the attacks are now scheduled for 3 weeks from today. The network is moving quickly to implement their operations before we can interfere with their plans. Eleanor felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. 3 weeks to organize and execute an operation that would either save American democracy or result in the deaths of everyone involved in the attempt. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the margin for error was essentially zero. I'm in, Eleanor said, making the decision that would define the rest of her life. Miguel died trying to stop these people. I won't let his sacrifice be meaningless. The other members of the resistance looked at Eleanor with approval, recognizing the transformation that had taken place since she had first discovered Miguel's hidden chamber. The frightened widow who had fled her farm was gone, replaced by an operative who was ready to risk everything to prevent the destruction of American democracy. There's something else, Sarah said, hesitating as if she wasn't sure Eleanor was ready for additional revelations. Miguel left specific instructions. For you, sealed orders that were only to be opened if he died and you discovered his cache. He knew that someday you might be forced to choose between your safety and your country's future. Eleanor felt her heart racing as Sarah handed her an envelope that bore Miguel's handwriting. Inside was a letter that had been written months before. His death, along with additional documents that Miguel had kept separate from his main intelligence cache. My beloved Eleanor, the letter began. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have discovered the truth about my work. I know how difficult this must be for you, and I am sorry that I could not share these burdens with you while I was alive. But I always knew that someday the fight against the network would fall to people like you, honest Americans who understand that some things are worth dying for. Eleanor continued reading, tears streaming down her face as Miguel's final words revealed the depth of his love for her and his faith in her ability to complete the work he had started. He had known that she possessed the skills and character necessary to oppose the network, and he had spent years preparing for the day when she would be forced to make that choice. The additional documents Miguel had left for Eleanor contained the final pieces of information necessary to implement his disclosure strategy. Network communication codes, safe house locations, contact information for resistant cells in other countries, and detailed instructions for coordinating simultaneous releases of information across multiple platforms and jurisdictions. Eleanor realized that Miguel had not just documented the network's crimes, he had created a comprehensive strategy for defeating them. Everything she needed to prevent the terrorist attacks and expose the conspiracy was contained in the materials he had preserved for her. The question now was whether she and her allies had the courage and skill to implement Miguel's plan before time ran out. As night fell over the mountain safe house, Eleanor found herself looking at her reflection in the cabin's bulletproof windows. The woman staring back at her bore little resemblance to the bankrupt widow who had discovered a hidden chamber beneath her chicken coop just days ago. This was someone who had accepted responsibility for preventing the destruction of everything she believed in. Someone who would risk her life to honor her husband's memory and protect her country's future. The next 3 weeks would determine whether American democracy survived or died, whether the Constitution remained the supreme law of the land or became a meaningless historical artifact. Eleanor had never imagined that her life would lead to such a moment of consequence, but she was ready to meet the challenge that fate had placed before her. Eleanor stood before a wall-mounted display screen showing a map of the United States, with dozens of red pins marking network safe houses, operational centers, and communication nodes that Miguel had identified over decades of careful observation. The mountain cabin had been transformed into a war room where 8 former intelligence operatives were planning the most ambitious counterintelligence operation in American history. They had 17 days to prevent coordinated terrorist attacks, while simultaneously exposing a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. The scale of Miguel's intelligence gathering became clear as Eleanor and her allies sorted through thousands of documents, photographs, and digital files that painted a comprehensive picture of the network's structure and operations. Miguel hadn't just collected evidence of criminal activity. He had mapped the entire organization, identifying key personnel, funding sources, communication protocols, and operational procedures that could be used to dismantle the conspiracy. "Your husband was more than just a logistics coordinator," said Marcus Webb, a former NSA analyst who had joined the resistance after discovering that his surveillance programs were being used to monitor American citizens without constitutional authorization. Miguel was building a counterintelligence operation that could neutralize the network's ability to function. These files contain everything we need to shut them down permanently. Eleanor studied personnel files that revealed the network's leadership structure, noting that many of the names were familiar from news reports about government officials, corporate executives, and military leaders. The conspiracy involved people she had seen on television discussing national security policy, individuals who presented themselves as patriotic Americans while secretly planning to eliminate the constitutional protections they had sworn to defend. "Senator Richardson," Eleanor said, reading from one of the files. "He chairs the Senate Intelligence Committee. I've seen him on the news arguing for stronger surveillance powers to fight terrorism." Sarah nodded grimly. "Richardson has been one of the network's primary political assets for over a decade. Every piece of legislation he's proposed has been designed to expand government surveillance capabilities while reducing judicial oversight. He's been preparing the legal framework for the police state they're planning to implement." The personnel files revealed that the network had placed operatives in key positions throughout the government, creating a shadow command structure that could assume control of critical institutions when the terrorist attacks provided justification for declaring martial law. The conspiracy wasn't just planning to exploit a crisis. They were planning to create and manage every aspect of that crisis to achieve their political objectives. Eleanor found herself studying photographs of network training facilities where operatives learned to carry out false flag operations designed to appear as foreign terrorist attacks. The facilities were located on private land owned by defense contractors, hidden from public view and protected by security measures that rivaled those of official military installations. The network had created a parallel military infrastructure that could carry out operations without oversight from constitutional authorities. They've been preparing for this for years, Eleanor realized, as she reviewed training schedules and operational plans. The attacks aren't a response to current events. They're the culmination of a long-term strategy to eliminate constitutional government. David joined Eleanor at the display screen, adding additional pins to mark network assets that had been identified through cross-referencing Miguel's files with intelligence gathered by other resistance cells. The map was becoming a comprehensive picture of a shadow organization that operated parallel to legitimate government institutions while working to undermine them from within. The beauty of Miguel's strategy, David explained, is that he didn't just collect evidence of individual crimes. He documented the entire network's structure and operations, creating a roadmap that shows how all the pieces fit together. When we release this information, people will be able to see the full scope of the conspiracy rather than dismissing individual revelations as isolated incidents. Eleanor understood the importance of presenting the network's activities as a coordinated conspiracy rather than a series of unrelated crimes. Individual revelations could be explained away or discredited, but the comprehensive picture Miguel had assembled would be impossible to dismiss or suppress. The evidence would speak for itself, demonstrating patterns of activity that could only be explained by the existence of a coordinated effort to subvert American democracy. The communication intercepts Miguel had collected revealed the network's internal discussions about timing and methodology for the planned attacks. Eleanor read transcripts of conversations between network leaders as they debated whether to use chemical weapons, biological agents, or conventional explosives to maximize casualties and media impact. The casual tone of these discussions, as if they were planning a business strategy rather than mass murder, made Eleanor's blood run cold. They're not just planning to kill innocent people, Eleanor said, her voice tight with controlled anger. They're treating American citizens as expendable resources in a campaign to increase their own power and wealth. Marcus looked up from the computer terminal where he was analyzing the network's communication protocols. The intercepts show that they've been planning variations of these attacks for years, waiting for the right political moment to implement them. Your discovery of Miguel's cache forced them to accelerate their timeline, but they've been ready to execute these operations whenever it served their purposes. Eleanor realized that the network's willingness to murder thousands of Americans wasn't driven by ideology or strategic necessity. It was simply the most efficient method they had identified for achieving their political and financial objectives. The people planning these attacks weren't motivated by religious extremism or foreign nationalism. They were motivated by greed and the desire for absolute power over American society. The financial records Miguel had preserved painted an equally disturbing picture of how the network funded its operations. Shell companies, offshore accounts, and cryptocurrency transactions created a web of financial relationships that connected the conspiracy to some of the largest corporations and wealthiest individuals in America. The network wasn't just a rogue intelligence operation. It was a business enterprise that used political manipulation to generate enormous profits. Defense contractors, oil companies, pharmaceutical corporations, private security firms, Sarah read from a list of network-affiliated businesses. They profit from every aspect of the surveillance state they're creating. Military conflicts generate weapons sales. Domestic surveillance creates demand for security technology, and medical emergencies justify pharmaceutical interventions. The network has created a business model that requires constant crisis and conflict. Eleanor studied the financial flows that connected network operations to legitimate businesses, noting that the same companies that profited from government contracts were also funding the activities designed to expand government powers. The network had created a self-reinforcing system where corporate profits depended on the elimination of constitutional protections that might limit government spending on security and military operations. The scope of the financial conspiracy was staggering. Eleanor found evidence that the network had manipulated stock markets, influenced currency exchange rates, and engineered economic crises to benefit their investment portfolios. The 2008 financial crisis, the European debt crisis, and several regional conflicts had all been artificially created or extended to generate profits for network-affiliated businesses. They're not just planning to suspend the Constitution, Eleanor realized. They're planning to restructure the entire American economy to serve their interests. The terrorist attacks are just the beginning of a comprehensive transformation of American society. David nodded, pointing to economic projections that showed how the network planned to benefit from the chaos they were creating. Martial law would allow them to suspend labor protections, environmental regulations, and financial oversight. They could essentially colonize America, extracting resources and exploiting workers without any legal constraints. Eleanor felt overwhelmed by the scope of the conspiracy she was uncovering. The network wasn't just planning terrorist attacks. They were planning to transform America into a feudal society where a small group of wealthy elites controlled every aspect of economic and political life. The Constitution wasn't just an obstacle to their security operations. It was the primary barrier preventing them from establishing complete dominance over American society. The resistance had identified several potential allies within the government who might be willing to act on Miguel's evidence, but contacting these individuals without alerting the network to their activities would require careful coordination and sophisticated operational security. The network's surveillance capabilities made it dangerous to communicate through normal channels, requiring the resistance to use methods that would be invisible to electronic monitoring. "We'll need to approach our targets simultaneously," Sarah explained as the team planned their disclosure operation. "If we contact people one at a time, the network will detect our activities and neutralize both us and our contacts before we can present the full scope of the evidence." Eleanor studied the list of potential allies Miguel had identified, noting that it included officials from all three branches of government, as well as journalists, academics, and foreign intelligence services that might be willing to help expose the conspiracy. The disclosure operation would need to coordinate approaches to dozens of individuals across multiple countries, presenting Miguel's evidence in a format that would be impossible for the network to suppress or discredit. "What about operational security?" Eleanor asked. "How do we coordinate all these simultaneous approaches without the network detecting our communications?" Marcus smiled, showing Eleanor a communication system Miguel had designed specifically for this purpose. "Your husband created a quantum-encrypted network that uses satellite relays positioned outside the range of terrestrial surveillance systems. We can coordinate with resistance cells around the world without the network being able to intercept or trace our communications." Eleanor marveled at the sophistication of Miguel's preparations, realizing that her husband had spent years developing the technical infrastructure necessary to expose the network's activities. He had anticipated every challenge they would face and created solutions that would allow the resistance to operate despite the network's overwhelming advantages in resources and technology. The Safe House's communication center came alive as resistance cells around the world confirmed their readiness to participate in the coordinated disclosure operation. Eleanor watched displays showing secure connections to allies in London, Berlin, Tokyo and Sydney, all of whom had been waiting for the signal to begin simultaneous approaches to government officials, journalists and international organizations. How many people are involved in this operation? Eleanor asked, watching the global coordination that Miguel's planning had made possible. Over 200 former intelligence operatives from 12 countries, David replied. Miguel spent years building relationships with people who shared his concerns about the direction of Western intelligence operations. The network isn't just an American conspiracy. It has international connections that require an international response. Eleanor understood that Miguel had been building more than just a resistance movement. He had been creating a shadow network of honest intelligence professionals who could coordinate efforts to preserve democratic institutions around the world. The conspiracy they were fighting wasn't limited to America, and neither was the opposition to that conspiracy. The final phase of preparation involved creating multiple backup plans for each aspect of the disclosure operation. Eleanor and her allies knew that the network would respond aggressively once they realized their activities were being exposed, using every resource at their disposal to suppress the evidence and eliminate the people responsible for releasing it. Once we begin the disclosure operation, there's no going back, Sarah warned as the team made final preparations. The network will know we're responsible, and they'll stop at nothing to prevent this information from reaching the public. We need to be prepared for the possibility that not all of us will survive the next few weeks. Eleanor looked around at the faces of the people who had risked everything to prevent mass murder and preserve constitutional government. These were individuals who had dedicated their lives to serving their countries, only to discover that they had been manipulated into supporting activities that threatened the very freedoms they thought they were protecting. Their willingness to sacrifice their own safety to expose the truth represented everything that was best about the intelligence profession. Miguel knew the risks when he started collecting this evidence, Eleanor said, her voice carrying the determination that had sustained her through her most difficult military deployments. He was willing to die to prevent these attacks and preserve American democracy. I won't dishonor his memory by letting fear prevent us from completing his work. The resistance had 13 days to coordinate and execute the most complex intelligence operation in modern history. They would need to overcome surveillance systems designed by the world's most sophisticated intelligence agencies, evade capture by operatives who had decades of experience in eliminating security threats, and present evidence that would convince skeptical officials to take actions that could prevent thousands of deaths. Eleanor realized that her journey from bankrupt widow to resistance operative was approaching its climax. Everything she had learned about Miguel's secret life, everything she had discovered about the network's criminal activities, and everything she had experienced since finding that hidden chamber beneath her chicken coop had prepared her for the next 2 weeks. The success or failure of their operation would determine whether American democracy survived or died, whether the Constitution remained the supreme law of the land or became a historical curiosity. As Eleanor prepared for sleep in the mountain, safe house, she found herself thinking about the farm she had been forced to abandon, the life she had been living before discovering Miguel's secrets. That existence seemed like it belonged to someone else, a different woman who had never imagined that her personal tragedy would lead to involvement in events that could reshape the future of human freedom. The network had destroyed her old life. When they killed Miguel, and orchestrated the foreclosure of her farm. But in doing so, they had created an enemy who possessed both the evidence and the determination necessary to destroy them in return. Eleanor had lost everything she thought she valued, only to discover that she was capable of fighting for things that were infinitely more important than personal security or financial stability. The assault began at 4:17 a.m. when motion sensors around the mountain safe house detected multiple teams approaching through the forest from 3 different directions. Eleanor jolted awake to the sound of Sarah's voice over the facility's intercom system, her military training instantly alert despite the early hour. The network had found them, and they were coming with overwhelming force to recover Miguel's documents and eliminate everyone who had seen them. All stations, we have incoming hostiles from the north, east, and southwest. Sarah's voice was calm but urgent. Estimate 40 to 50 operatives in full tactical gear. This is not a capture operation. They're here to eliminate witnesses. Eleanor rolled out of her bunk and grabbed the tactical vest and weapons that David had insisted she keep within arm's reach. Through the bulletproof windows, she could see muzzle flashes in the darkness as the network's assault teams engaged. The perimeter defenses that Miguel had built into the facility's design. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoed through the mountain valley, a deadly symphony that announced the beginning of the final confrontation. The safe house's defensive systems activated automatically, flooding the surrounding area with infrared illumination that would blind night vision equipment while providing clear targeting information to the facility's occupants. Eleanor could see dozens of figures moving through the forest, their professional coordination and advanced equipment confirming that the network had deployed their most elite operatives for this assault. "They're not trying to take us alive," Marcus observed as he monitored the attackers' movements from the facility's command center. "These are termination orders. They'd rather destroy Miguel's evidence than risk having it exposed." Eleanor felt a cold clarity settle over her thoughts as she realized the implications of the network's attack. They had been monitoring the Resistance's activities despite the sophisticated operational security measures Miguel had designed, and they had decided that the threat of exposure was too great to allow the disclosure operation to proceed. The network was willing to sacrifice their secrecy to prevent their criminal activities from being revealed. David coordinated the facility's defensive response from a reinforced command bunker, his decades of military experience evident in the calm efficiency with which he deployed the safe house's resources. "Eleanor, Sarah, I need you to prepare the emergency communication protocols. If we can't hold this position, we need to ensure that Miguel's evidence reaches our allies, regardless of what happens to us." Eleanor moved to the communication center, where Sarah was already activating the quantum-encrypted network that connected them to resistance cells around the world. The disclosure operation had been scheduled to begin in 8 days, but the network's assault meant they would need to implement Miguel's plan immediately, or risk losing the opportunity entirely. "London Station, this is Mountain Base," Sarah spoke into the encrypted communication system. "We are under attack and implementing emergency protocols. Initiate disclosure operation immediately. Repeat, initiate disclosure operation immediately." Similar messages went out to resistance cells in Berlin, Tokyo, Sydney, and a dozen other locations where former intelligence operatives were prepared to begin simultaneous approaches to government officials, journalists, and international organizations. The network's attempt to silence the resistance was triggering the very response they had hoped to prevent. The facility's defensive systems were holding, but Eleanor could see that the attackers were adapting their tactics to overcome Miguel's preparations. They were using shaped charges to breach the reinforced walls, deploying jamming equipment to disrupt the facility's communication systems, and coordinating their assault with surgical precision that spoke of extensive planning and reconnaissance. They know the facility's layout, Eleanor realized, as she watched the attackers move directly toward the safe house's most vulnerable points. Someone gave them detailed information about Miguel's defensive systems. Sarah's expression darkened as she considered the implications of Eleanor's observation. We have a traitor in the resistance. Someone has been feeding information to the network about our activities and location. The revelation that their security had been compromised from within added another layer of complexity to an already desperate situation. Eleanor realized that the network's ability to find the safe house and plan such a precise assault meant that their enemies had been monitoring the resistance's activities from the beginning, allowing them to coordinate their response to the disclosure operation. "It doesn't matter now," David said over the intercom, as explosions shook the facility's foundation. "Our immediate priority is ensuring that Miguel's evidence reaches the public. Eleanor, I need you to prepare the emergency data burst that will transmit everything to our backup sites." Eleanor had trained on the emergency transmission system during her first days at the safe house, but she had never expected to use it under combat conditions. The system was designed to compress and transmit Miguel's entire intelligence archive in a matter of minutes, sending the data to secure servers around the world where it could be disseminated even if the original sources were eliminated. Facility's power systems flickered as the network's assault teams used electromagnetic pulse weapons to disrupt the safe house's electronic systems. Eleanor worked frantically to complete the data transmission, while backup generators struggled to maintain power to the communication equipment. Through the reinforced walls, she could hear the sound of the attackers' voices as they breached. "The facility's outer defenses. Transmission at 60%, Eleanor reported as she monitored the data upload progress. "We need another 3 minutes to complete the full archive transfer." David's voice came over the intercom with the calm professionalism that Eleanor had learned to associate with veterans who had faced death many times before. "We'll hold them as long as possible. Marcus, Sarah, prepare the facility for emergency destruction. If they take this position, we ensure that nothing useful survives." Eleanor understood that David was preparing to destroy the safe house rather than allow the network to recover any intelligence about the resistance's activities or capabilities. The facility's destruction would eliminate the evidence of Miguel's work, but it would also prevent the network from learning about the disclosure operation that was now beginning in locations around the world. The sound of gunfire was getting closer as the attackers overcame the facility's automated defenses and began their final assault on the safe house itself. Eleanor could see muzzle flashes through the bulletproof windows as network operatives positioned themselves for a coordinated breach of the main structure. The facility's defenders were vastly outnumbered, but they were fighting for something more important than their own survival. "Transmission at 85%, Eleanor announced as the data upload approached completion. 2 more minutes and Miguel's evidence will be beyond their reach." A massive explosion shook the facility as the attackers used breaching charges to create entry points in the reinforced walls. Eleanor could hear the sound of tactical teams moving through the facility's corridors, their professional coordination evident in the way they cleared each room before advancing to the next target. The network had deployed their most elite operatives for this assault, individuals who'd been trained to eliminate high-value targets under the most challenging conditions. Sarah appeared at Eleanor's side, her tactical vest torn and blood streaking, her face from a wound that she ignored with the focused determination of a combat veteran. "The main entry points are compromised," she reported. "David's holding the command bunker, but we have hostile forces on 3 levels of the facility." Eleanor watched the transmission progress indicator climb toward completion, knowing that each second brought Miguel's evidence closer to global dissemination. The network's assault had triggered the disclosure operation 8 days ahead of schedule. But the resistance's international coordination meant that the evidence would reach its intended targets regardless of what happened to the people who had gathered it. "Transmission complete," Eleanor announced, as the final data packets uploaded to secure servers around the world. "Miguel's evidence is now in the hands of our allies. Whatever happens here, the truth will be revealed." The facility's emergency destruction sequence activated automatically as network operatives breached the final defensive positions. Eleanor and Sarah ran toward the command bunker, where David was coordinating the facility's final defense, knowing that they had minutes at most before the safe house was completely overrun. The command bunker's reinforced door sealed behind them, as they joined David and Marcus in the facility's most protected location. Through the bunker's monitors, they could see network operatives moving through the safe house's corridors, searching for survivors and intelligence materials. The attackers moved with the efficiency of professionals who understood that their mission was time-sensitive and that their targets were equally professional. "London confirms receipt of the data package," Marcus reported from the bunker's communication station. "They're beginning immediate distribution to government officials and media outlets. Berlin and Tokyo are reporting similar confirmations." Eleanor felt a surge of satisfaction as she realized that Miguel's evidence was now beyond the network's ability to suppress. The disclosure operation was proceeding as planned, with resistance cells around the world presenting comprehensive evidence of the network's criminal activities to officials who had the authority to prevent the planned terrorist attacks. David activated the facility's final defensive measures, sealing the command bunker and preparing to defend their position until the emergency destruction sequence eliminated any possibility of the network recovering useful intelligence. The bunker was designed to withstand direct assault for several hours, giving the resistance time to ensure that their global disclosure operation was completed successfully. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't fully realized she had been carrying. The disclosure operation had succeeded in its primary objective, preventing the murder of thousands of innocent Americans. Miguel's sacrifice and the resistance's efforts had not been in vain. "The political implications are still being sorted out," Hayes continued, her tone becoming more serious. "The evidence you provided has implicated officials at every level of government, from local law enforcement to cabinet secretaries. The President has authorized the formation of a special commission to investigate the full scope of the network's activities and recommend appropriate responses." Eleanor opened her eyes and studied Hayes's face, looking for signs that would indicate whether the colonel could be trusted with sensitive information. The network's infiltration of government institutions meant that even well-intentioned officials might be reporting to compromised superiors who could use their information to protect network operatives. "How do I know you're not part of the network?" Eleanor asked directly. "How do I know this entire conversation isn't an attempt to assess what additional evidence might still exist?" Hayes reached into her uniform pocket and produced a photograph that made Eleanor's breath catch. The image showed Miguel and Hayes together at what appeared to be a military ceremony, both wearing dress uniforms and standing with a group of other officers. The photograph was dated 3 years earlier, suggesting a relationship that predated Miguel's involvement with the resistance. "Your husband and I served together on a joint intelligence committee that was investigating irregularities in defense contracting," Hayes explained. "Miguel came to me 2 years ago with concerns about activities that appeared to involve current and former intelligence operatives. He asked me to serve as a contact point within official channels if circumstances ever required the information he was gathering to be presented to legitimate authorities." Eleanor studied the photograph, noting details that confirmed Hayes's story. Miguel's body language in the image suggested comfort and trust with his companions, and Eleanor could see the same careful attention to detail in his uniform that had characterized his appearance throughout their marriage. The photograph appeared genuine, and Hayes's knowledge of Miguel's activities was consistent with what Eleanor had learned about her husband's preparations. Miguel left specific instructions about who should be contacted if his evidence needed to be presented to official channels. Hayes continued, I was designated as the primary military liaison for any investigation that might result from the disclosure of his intelligence materials. The information you provided has been authenticated and is being acted upon by officials who have been thoroughly vetted for network connections. Eleanor felt cautiously optimistic about Hayes's explanation, but she remained aware that the network's sophistication might extend to creating elaborate deceptions to convince her that their conspiracy had been exposed when it had actually been contained. The stakes were too high to trust anyone completely, regardless of their apparent credentials or relationship to Miguel. What happens now? Eleanor asked. The network spent decades infiltrating government institutions. Even if some of their operatives have been arrested, others must still be in positions where they can protect the conspiracy or retaliate against people who expose them. Hayes nodded, acknowledging the complexity of the situation. You're right to be concerned. The investigation has revealed that the network's influence was far more extensive than anyone realized. We've identified operatives in the CIA, FBI, NSA, and Pentagon, as well as staff members for dozens of congressional offices. Removing these individuals while preserving the integrity of our institutions is requiring careful coordination at the highest levels. Eleanor understood that the investigation faced the same challenges that had made the network so difficult to expose in the first place. The conspiracy had infiltrated the very institutions that were now responsible for investigating and prosecuting its members. Even honest officials would struggle to distinguish between legitimate intelligence activities and criminal operations that had been disguised as national security measures. The financial aspects of the investigation are proving particularly revealing, Hayes continued. The network's business operations generated billions of dollars in illegal profits that were used to fund political campaigns, purchase media companies, and establish front organizations that influenced public opinion. We're working with international partners to freeze assets and trace financial transactions that may lead to additional operatives. Eleanor realized that Miguel's financial records were providing investigators with a roadmap to dismantling the network's support structure. The conspiracy had required enormous resources to maintain its operations over decades, and those financial requirements had created vulnerabilities that could now be exploited by honest officials. What about the foreign connections? Eleanor asked, remembering the international scope of the network's activities that she had discovered in Miguel's files. The network wasn't just an American conspiracy. It had operatives and business relationships around the world. Hayes's expression grew more serious. That's one of the most disturbing aspects of what we've uncovered. The network appears to have been part of a larger international organization that included operatives from multiple countries. We're coordinating with allied intelligence services to investigate these connections, but the scope of the conspiracy is larger than anyone initially realized. Eleanor felt overwhelmed by the implications of what Hayes was describing. The network she had helped expose wasn't just a threat to American democracy. It was part of a global conspiracy that threatened democratic institutions worldwide. The Resistance's disclosure operation had apparently triggered investigations in multiple countries as officials began to understand the international scope of the threat they were facing. The good news, Hayes continued, is that the disclosure operation you coordinated was more successful than you might realize. The Simultaneous release of information in multiple countries prevented the network from suppressing the evidence or eliminating key witnesses. International cooperation has been exceptional, with allies sharing intelligence and coordinating arrests to prevent network operatives from escaping to safe havens. Eleanor allowed herself to feel cautiously optimistic about the investigations and progress, but she remained aware that the network's decades of preparation meant they likely had contingency plans for dealing with exposure. The arrests and asset seizures that Hayes described might represent only the most visible aspects of a conspiracy that included backup operatives and hidden resources. "There's something else you need to know," Hayes said, her tone becoming more personal. "The investigation has revealed that your husband's death wasn't from natural causes. The autopsy results show evidence of a sophisticated poison that mimics the symptoms of cardiac arrest. Miguel was murdered because the network discovered his intelligence-gathering activities and decided he posed too great a threat to their operations." Eleanor felt a familiar surge of anger as her suspicions about Miguel's death were confirmed. Her husband had been killed by the same people he had spent years serving, eliminated because he had developed a conscience about their criminal activities. The network's willingness to murder their own operatives demonstrated the ruthlessness that had made them so dangerous to democratic institutions. "We're treating Miguel's death as the first case in what will likely be a series of prosecutions for the murder of former network operatives," Hayes continued. "The evidence suggests that dozens of people who attempted to leave the network or expose its activities were eliminated to protect the conspiracy's security." Eleanor understood that Miguel's murder represented just one example of the network's willingness to kill anyone who threatened their operations. The resistance members who had died in the safe house assault had been part of a larger pattern of violence that the network had used to maintain its secrecy and eliminate potential threats. "What about witness protection?" Eleanor asked, recognizing that her survival and knowledge of the network's activities made her a continuing target. "The network's operatives who haven't been arrested will want to eliminate anyone who can testify about their activities." "Network operatives are requesting instructions," Marcus reported as he monitored the attackers' communications. "They're not finding the intelligence materials they expected to recover. Our data destruction protocols worked. They're recovering nothing useful." Eleanor realized that the network's assault had failed to achieve its primary objective. They had deployed enormous resources to prevent the disclosure of Miguel's evidence, but their attack had actually triggered the very response they had hoped to prevent. The Resistance's careful planning and international coordination had turned the network's aggression against them. The bunker's monitors showed network operatives preparing to breach the command center's defenses using explosive charges that would collapse the entire structure. Eleanor understood that they had minutes before the facility's destruction, but she also knew that their sacrifice had ensured the success of Miguel's plan to expose the conspiracy and prevent mass murder. "Sydney is reporting that their government contacts are taking immediate action," Sarah announced as she monitored global communications. "Intelligence services in Australia and New Zealand are coordinating with American allies to prevent the planned attacks." Eleanor watched the monitors showing network operatives positioning breaching charges around the command bunker, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether the Resistance's sacrifice had been meaningful. The disclosure operation was proceeding as planned, but the network's response would determine whether the evidence reached the public before they could implement their terrorist attacks. "All stations, this is Mountain Base with final transmission." David spoke into the global communication network. "Mission accomplished. Miguel's evidence is now in the hands of honest officials around the world. The network's plans have been exposed, and their attacks can be prevented. Whatever happens to us, the truth will survive." Eleanor felt a sense of completion as she realized that her journey from bankrupt widow to resistance operative had reached its culmination. She had discovered Miguel's secrets, survived the network's attempts to silence her, and helped expose a conspiracy that threatened the future of human freedom. The woman who had found a hidden chamber beneath her chicken coop had become someone who had helped save American democracy. The explosive charges detonated with a roar that shook the mountain valley, collapsing the safe house and sealing the command bunker beneath tons of rubble and debris. Eleanor and her allies had given their lives to ensure that Miguel's evidence reached the people who could act on it, transforming their personal sacrifice into a victory for the principles they had sworn to defend. But even as the facility collapsed, around them, secure communication networks were carrying Miguel's evidence to officials and journalists around the world. The network's attempt to silence the resistance had failed, and their criminal conspiracy was now exposed to public scrutiny. The disclosure operation was proceeding exactly as Miguel had planned, with international coordination that would make it impossible for the network to suppress the evidence or prevent the exposure of their activities. The terrorist attacks that had been planned to justify the suspension of constitutional government would never occur, prevented by the evidence that Miguel had preserved and the resistance had disseminated. The network's decades-long conspiracy had been exposed. Their financial resources would be frozen, and their political allies would be forced to distance themselves from activities that had now been revealed to the public. Eleanor's last thought, as the bunker collapsed, was that Miguel would have been proud of what they had accomplished. His careful planning and patient intelligence gathering had made it possible for a small group of former operatives to expose and defeat a conspiracy that had threatened the future of democratic government. The hidden chamber beneath their chicken coop had contained more than just evidence of criminal activity. It had contained the tools necessary to preserve the constitutional freedoms that defined American democracy. The network had killed Miguel to prevent him from exposing their activities, but his death had only ensured that his evidence would reach the people who could act on it. Eleanor had completed her husband's work, honoring his memory while protecting the country they had both sworn to serve. The sacrifice of the resistance had prevented mass murder and preserved the constitutional protections that made freedom possible. Eleanor opened her eyes to the sterile white ceiling of a hospital room, fluorescent lights creating harsh shadows that made her squint as consciousness slowly returned. Her body ached with the deep, grinding pain of someone who had been buried under tons of concrete and steel, yet somehow survived what should have been certain death. The steady beeping of medical monitors provided a rhythmic backdrop to her. Confusion, as she tried to understand how she could be alive when her last memory was of the command bunker collapsing around her. A figure moved in her peripheral vision, and Eleanor turned her head carefully to see a woman in military dress uniform, sitting beside her bed. The woman's insignia identified her as a colonel in the U.S. Army, but her face was unfamiliar despite the knowing expression in her eyes that suggested she understood far more about Eleanor's situation than a random military officer should. "Mrs. Vasquez, I'm Colonel Janet Hayes with Army Intelligence," the woman said, her voice carrying the professional warmth of someone trained to extract information from reluctant subjects. "You've been unconscious for 6 days. The rescue teams found you and 2 of your companions in an air pocket beneath the collapsed safe house. You're very lucky to be alive." Eleanor's mind raced as she processed this information, trying to reconcile her memories of the facility's destruction with the reality of her survival. The command bunker had been designed with emergency life support systems that could sustain occupants for extended periods. But she hadn't expected those systems to function after the catastrophic collapse that had buried the entire facility. "Sarah and David?" Eleanor asked, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube that had apparently been removed recently. "Are they alive?" Colonel Hayes nodded, but her expression remained carefully neutral. "They're in critical condition, but stable. The three of you were found together in what appears to have been a reinforced emergency shelter within the command structure. It's quite remarkable that anyone survived such a complete structural collapse." Eleanor understood that Hayes was fishing for information about the safe house's construction and the circumstances that had led to its destruction. The colonel's presence suggested that the military was now involved in the investigation of the network's activities, but Eleanor wasn't certain whether Hayes represented honest officials or network operatives attempting to assess the damage. From the disclosure operation. "I need to know the status of the disclosure operation," Eleanor said, testing Hayes's knowledge of recent events. "Were Miguel's files successfully distributed to the intended recipients?" Hayes leaned forward slightly, her expression shifting to one of genuine concern. "Mrs. Vasquez, I need you to understand that your actions over the past few weeks have had consequences that reach the highest levels of government. The information that was disseminated from your location has triggered the largest counterintelligence investigation in American history." Eleanor felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension. The colonel's words suggested that the disclosure operation had succeeded in reaching government officials, but they also indicated that the investigation's outcome was still uncertain. The network's influence over American institutions meant that even honest officials might struggle to take effective action against such a well-established conspiracy. "What about the terrorist attacks?" Eleanor asked, her primary concern focused on preventing the mass casualties that the network had planned. Were they stopped? Colonel Hayes smiled for the first time since Eleanor had awakened, and the expression transformed her face from professional mask to genuine human warmth. "The attacks were prevented. Based on the intelligence you and your associates provided, joint task forces in 4 cities identified and neutralized the network's operational teams. Over 200 arrests were made, and enough explosive materials to level city blocks were recovered from safe houses across the country."